Joining me now is Avril Henry, who's written a recent book called Leadership Revelations 3. Welcome to the program, Avril.
Thanks very much for having me.
No worries. Now listen, as a part of preparing for the book or researching the book, you interviewed 91 women around the world.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, when I first started thinking about doing a book on gender, and I'll be honest and say this is a book I've wanted to write for about 20 years, but it's one of those books where you write it when people are ready to hear some of the messages. My long-term mentor, Anne Sherry, said to me, why don't you look at women in other countries and do a comparison between the experiences of women in Australia and women overseas? And at the time, Anne Sherry and I were going to a UN conference on the economic empowerment of women in Paris, which was a perfect opportunity to line up women from different countries. And so that's how it came about.
And what was your overall impression? I mean, obviously, there's quite a few hundred pages of detail in the book, but what did you come away from those interviews thinking?
Well, it's interesting because I suspected that perhaps women's experiences in the workplace and in political positions and even places like religious institutions, because I've always believed the three power bases of the world are large corporates, governments and religious institutions. And I suspected that maybe our experiences were the same in terms of discrimination on the basis of our gender. And, in some ways I was quite pleased to find that women's experiences, regardless of their cultural background or their industry background, had been similar. But the other interesting thing was that I'd made a decision to also cut the data, which is, the findings of the interviews, by generation, and there are 4 generations covered in the book. And what it shows is, yes, things for women have improved, but it's such a slow pace of change that with my economics background, I predict it'll be over 100 years before we have equality in any of those institutions.
Interesting. It was very interesting. It was a funny kind of thing in the foreword written by David Morrison, the Chief of the Army,
yes,
to the book, where he said he picked up a statement or an aphorism that said men are promoted on potential and women are promoted on proven performance, which he thought was so terrific. He used it all the time in a whole lot of speeches, and then he found out that was you.
Yes, yeah. And look, that's actually not meant to be in any way unkind towards men. And in fact, in the women's leadership programs and the mentoring I do for both senior women and senior men, I actually say that women can learn a lot from men about self-confidence. And effectively, there was a study done by the University of either Adelaide or South Australia some 20 years ago, which I believe is still valid today, which found that if there was a job which required 10 competencies and men had 5 or 6 of the 10 competencies, they would absolutely give it a go. They would say, look, the stuff that I don't know, I can wing it, I can delegate, I can learn on the job, or I can find somebody to show me what to do. Whereas women look at a job and they say, I've only got 9 of the 10, so I'll just have to wait until I've got 10 out of 10. And my reaction to that when I'm working with women is to say, if you are 100% ready for a job, what's to learn? So, no one is ever 100% ready for a job. So we can actually learn a lot from men about taking risks, because men take risks to a larger degree when it comes to their career, and I think in life generally, than women do.
One of the things you cover in the book is what men can do to create gender equality.
Yes.
What's the answer?
In fact, I wrote a blog about this just last night based on this part of the book. And look, I think the best thing, in fact, the 2 things that I identify out of the many things men can do is that we truly select people we truly select people for jobs based on merit. And I'll make a further comment. And the second is that we create truly flexible workplaces, but not just for women, for men. And if we create workplaces where people can make choices, not just about being parents, but about being carers for elderly parents, about pursuing sporting interests or interests in the arts, where we don't judge people on how much time they spend at work, but we judge our employees on their outputs and their results, then we make the world a better place, and the workplace, not just for women but men. Because I think there are plenty of men who, as parents, would like to spend more time with their children, but, it could be as career limiting for men to admit that as it already is for women.
But you say one of the things men can do is select people for jobs on the basis of merit, but isn't one of the problems that men sometimes have a different view of what merit is?
I think,
or a view of what merit is that sort of is inimical to women's prospects.
I think what happens is and certainly I've seen this in my earlier career in corporate life in HR, where I think we have, all of us, both men and women, some unconscious biases that we're not even aware of. So at one financial institution, I suggested that if they wanted the best people, that we follow a blind recruitment process. And what we actually did was we removed people's ages, we removed their titles, so Mr, Ms, whatever, and their gender. In fact, we removed their names. So all that people got of these 50 candidates for a short list of 12 for 6 middle management positions was their CVs, which described their achievements, their competencies, their skills and their education. And,
wow, what happened?
Well, this is fascinating. So we ended up with 12 people, and most of the men at the time, because this was more than a decade ago, most of the people on the panel were men. And they said to me, this selection process is flawed. And I said, why is that? Because by this stage we'd put all the personal details back. And they said, well, 9 of the 12 are women, and one of these women are over 50.
Oh, no.
Imagine that, a woman over 50. We're supposed to be invisible. And I said to them, I'll tell you what's flawed about this process is that we actually picked people based completely on merit, competencies and experience rather than their gender or their age. And can I just say that business unit went on to be one of the most successful, but sadly they didn't use that process again. And I think it's because people didn't like the outcome.
Yeah, I was going to say they didn't do that again, did they?
No. And can I just add to that, because I think this is relevant. One of my students, where I lectured for 8 years at the University of Western Sydney, topped her class in law. And because she is Middle Eastern, she's actually from Iraq and chooses to wear the scarf. And one of the most charming, intelligent, well-educated women I've ever met was telling me that when she tried to get a summer clerkship, she rang me up and she said, it's not working, I can't even get a summer clerkship. And yet, like one of her predecessors who I'd also worked with, who's also a Muslim boy, when they applied for jobs or internships, they weren't getting them. And I got them to change their names from very much Middle Eastern names to, in the case of the guy, to change his name from Muhammad to Michael. And in her case, I got her to change her name to Grace. And both of them then got interviews and went on to get jobs. And to their credit, they actually said, no, thank you, because when you first looked at our CVs and saw our names were Middle Eastern, you wouldn't even give us an interview. But once we changed our names to, what you could call Anglo-Saxon names, you were happy to give us a go. And yet they were the top students in their year in their law faculty. So there's a lot of bias in the way we view people for jobs that has nothing to do with our competencies and skills and abilities.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Avril, thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed being on your show.
I've been talking to Avril Henry, who's the author of Leadership Revelations 3, How We Achieve the Gender Tipping Point.